But arguably, Biden, given his historic failure and disillusionment of the Democratic base,
That has scarred so many people at this point.
could prove the case that that's not a safe candidate, actually. That's not the safe bet. Even Kamala Harris, an anonymous campaign aide, recently said to a New York magazine, is looking to see where the winds are blowing and positioning herself. Now, what I think that some of these candidates are showing you is they want to know what you believe. They don't want you to just pretend to believe what they believe.
Yes.
And that's the challenge, I think, the authenticity challenge for a lot of these candidates going forward. The fact that Warren, not Bernie Sanders, but Warren, sort of in between that bridge, could come out and say, I see Abdul's agenda as the most winnable and the most important thing to support. That tells you something about a faction of the establishment and the work within the system wing of the party that's willing to move towards the more progressive and outspoken statements that people like candidates in Colorado and New York have made about Israel would, even 2 years ago, have disqualified them from office forever. Is it so extreme to talk about sanctions on Israel, right? This is now part of the conversation we're in, where the Israeli extreme right has, of course, asked us to consider blessing some of their most just extreme violent ideas, like ethnic cleansing of Gaza. And the left is saying, okay, well then let's look on the other side and sort of how far are you willing to go that way to right-size this relationship and the dynamic.
In mid-July, a vote on arms sales to Israel saw a near-even split in the Democratic Party in Congress. An expert political commentator told AFP, when more than 100 House Democrats are willing to vote to cut military aid, that's no longer a protest vote. That's a signal that the party is undergoing a generational and ideological realignment. Today, we're going to take an in-depth look at how the question of Palestine has become a key determinant of the Democratic Party's future, and where it all started, in the Biden administration, when such a position was practically unthinkable. I'm joined by Akbar Shahid Ahmed, an award-winning foreign affairs correspondent, current diplomatic correspondent at Notice, and author of Crossing the Red Line, Biden, His Advisors, and Israel's War in Gaza. Let's talk a bit about all of the different candidates throughout New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Colorado, and several other states, Michigan particularly, but that's a bit of a different story than some of the races that have ended in victory.
Right, in deep blue areas.
Yeah, exactly, very deep blue areas. These candidates are winning on platforms as simple as babies, not bombs. And that, to me, would have been unimaginable 3 years ago. So what is the significance of embedding the rhetoric of a just foreign policy with a call for domestic affordability, security, right to health and wellness?
There's a real willingness to engage with foreign policy from these candidates, which is essentially rejecting the very old school machine politics view of just don't really talk about it. And if people have questions, just sort of give the general party line. And instead what these candidates, many of whom were themselves involved in anti-war activism, in calling out some of these policies and being very clear that they were threats to democracy at home and abroad, that these candidates are saying we have viewpoints here and we think these issues matter. It's also a view that's, to your point about being unimaginable, several years ago, even up until I would say the 2024 election cycle, you saw extreme hardline pro-Israel groups, most notably AIPAC, the country's biggest pro-Israel lobby, be able to silence and target some of these candidates. You saw that happen with Congresswoman Cori Bush in Missouri, Congressman Jamal Bowman in New York. And what they ran on was not Israel or foreign policy. What they targeted those candidates on was everything else, but they poured huge amounts of money into essentially turning their constituents against them, right? Particularly in deep blue areas. Now you've seen an infrastructure grow up on the kind of anti-war side. And that infrastructure, in part, the country does still run on money in politics. In part, that infrastructure is very well funded. You have a PAC called American Priorities PAC, which has supported a lot of these candidates. But a lot of it is grassroots energy. So you mentioned the Michigan race, and that's a really important one because it's a place where Abdul Sayed, the progressive candidate who's quite outspoken on Palestine, among other issues and domestic issues, is up against Haley Stevens, an extremely pro-Israel congresswoman, one of the most, who's getting a lot of money from outside groups. the grassroots energy and the grassroots fundraising is very much with Abdul in that race, right? And you saw that again with some of these people who came up in New York challenging machine politicians. Yeah. They were tapping the grassroots energy that Zoran Mamdani's campaign had built up the year before, and not just turning it into Palestine into a litmus test, or what do you say genocide, do you say free Palestine, but saying we have a full agenda and you've been failed for a very long time by your democratic establishment.
I think like it stuck out seriously to me, not just through Zohran's campaign, but seeing him endorse Daria Liza, Brad Lander, Clara Valdez, and the very specific point of view that they had, that these elements of living a comfortable life and living a equitable life in the U.S. is tied inextricably to justice in our foreign policy.
And to that point, I think they turned this into a winning message by making it a multi-ethnic and diverse coalition. And the way that often the issue of just foreign policy, particularly in the 2024 cycle, when democratic frustration over Gaza was so huge, I remember hearing this from campaign operatives working on key campaigns right up to the Biden-Harris presidential campaign. The idea was Gaza is an Arab or Muslim issue. It's only for them. It doesn't really matter, and if we lose them, we can still win the election. And there's been an evolution in thought that Americans themselves are piecing together foreign policy and basic humanity abroad with dignity and humanity at home. And these candidates are channeling that shift.
Exactly, yeah. And I kind of want to go to the point about, is this truly a representation of grassroots activism and grassroots organizing challenging the corporate PAC system that we've kind of accustomed ourselves to since Citizens United? Is there really a potential for a change to this landscape, or is it truly PACs battling it out in a sense?
PAC v PAC. I mean that that's still operating very much in the sort of traditional, you have to pay a lot for television ads, you have to pay a lot for digital, you have to pay a lot for field. However, I think it opens this window of possibility for reform and change in a way that we haven't had that conversation here in Washington or in Congress for a very long time, because the system has worked for a lot of these players, right? So as these shifts are happening, as these primary challengers who are more progressive, channeling that foreign policy frustration come up, they're also elevating talking points that you would never hear before on the floor of the United States Congress. So Mamdani, for example, is very much thinking beyond the bounds of New York to how do I build a congressional bloc. And it's interesting because there was a sort of trope that progressives don't know what to do with power. This was raised, when Bernie Sanders was running for president in 2016, raised when AOC won. Now progressives have a chance to show they can, and in Zoran Mamdani's New York, arguably they're already showing that, delivering on many of Mamdani's campaign promises within some of the first few months of his mayorship.
In really remarkable ways, in all of the ways that he promised, in coordination with the New York government, the New York state government, and it's a testament to this idea that power in progressive hands can be a force for good. Can
be used, and this idea that these are not, there's also been a narrative from the center of the Democratic Party, which I actually hate the term center, the establishment of the Democratic Party, let's say, which says these are not candidates who can win or inspire people. And that's why the Michigan race is so important, right? Because this is a Senate race that for Democrats it's essential. Without it, they have no hope of wielding the kind of power they want to wield in Washington come January. So they can't afford to lose this. Republicans have their candidate already. He's a well-known candidate. He has a lot of conservative money behind him. The argument over Abdul versus Haley Stevens is an argument over the type of candidate the party should run, but also the type of candidate who can win in a tight, hotly contested race with a Republican. And so in a way, it's a bit of a litmus test for the 2028 primary, where progressives are going to be making the argument, pick up one of our people, and they can defeat Trump's anointed successor, whether it's J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, or anyone else, or the establishment saying, no, go back to the model of Joe Biden. Yeah. You need that sort of safe, traditional, sort of seen candidate. But arguably, Biden, given his historic failure and disillusionment of the Democratic base,
That has scarred so many people at this point.
could prove the case that that's not a safe candidate, actually. That's not the safe bet.
And kind of looking to the 2028 election, I mean, you even have people like Rahm Emanuel, who, for better or worse, has his eye on a presidential nomination, saying that Israel's path is not sustainable politically. What does it mean that these kinds of candidates are even speaking in this way now?
Yeah, you see it in Rahm Emanuel's positioning, his high-profile speech in Tel Aviv, where he effectively said the U.S.-Israel relationship has to change. Not in huge ways, but in some ways. Important to note, it was presented as a dramatic change. It wasn't. And you see J.D. Vance, going on Theo Vaughn's podcast and saying, Israel drew us into this war with Iran. I don't want to be so associated with Israel, expressing skepticism. So that appetite is now being translated in a frankly organic and healthy way for American democracy, that people feel this way and politicians feel they have to talk about that way, right? So that's sort of getting to that question of, can the disfiguring influence of money in politics be taken out, and so it's more of a direct democratic system. Maybe these conversations about Israel can sort of lead to that. However, I always sort of encourage people to think about how deeply entrenched the system is, right? And the sort of bias, the assumption of being maybe not unconditionally pro-Israel, but reflexively pro-Israel, and how much that's still very much a desire of donors, of some organized election groups. That's not going to go away, and we're only starting to see the pushback in response to this questioning. All of that to say, the sort of progressive wind is really what even Kamala Harris, who lost in part because of her embrace of just inconceivable violence against Palestinians. Even Kamala Harris, an anonymous campaign aide, recently said to a New York magazine, is looking to see where the winds are blowing and positioning herself. Now, what I think that some of these candidates are showing you is they want to know what you believe. They don't want you to just pretend to believe what they believe. Yes. And that's the challenge, I think, the authenticity challenge for a lot of these candidates going forward.
And this question of authenticity and accountability within the establishment, do you think it can be drawn even back to the DNC autopsy that refused to even name Palestine and Gaza as a legitimate consideration in the loss at the end of those 107 days?
The DNC frustration runs so deep still. I've been talking to a lot of people in Michigan for some reporting around the Democratic Senate primary there, and the scars of that moment, and the feeling that what Democrats did then cannot be recreated. Michigan, of course, was the heart of the uncommitted movement, the kind of anti-war movement that asked the DNC to, at the very least, platform a speaker speaking up about Gaza, and the DNC at the convention said no. So I think Michigan is a place where you'll see that tested. But again, you still see a huge amount of the Democratic establishment rallying behind Haley Stevens. You see, for instance, Neera Tanden, the head of the Center for American Progress think tank, a former senior official in the Obama and Biden administrations, spending, it seems, most of her day online fighting about Abdul versus Haley. So this has become seen as a battle over the future of the party and who will hold the reins. And those who've held it for a long time are not going to let go very easily. But the bellwethers, I think, are interesting and increasingly optimistic for progressives. So a sign that I saw on that Michigan race, I've been waiting to see where Elizabeth Warren would come out.
Appreciated that endorsement.
She came out in support of Abdul Sayed. She had been a supporter of Mallory McMurrow, the third candidate in that race, who withdrew and is not going to make an endorsement. The fact that Warren, not Bernie Sanders, but Warren, sort of in between that bridge, could come out and say, I see Abdul's agenda as the most winnable and the most important thing to support. That tells you something about a faction of the establishment and the work within the system wing of the party that's willing to move towards a more progressive and outspoken group.
And see the potential and see that maintaining the status quo has not proven successful in any sense and likely needs a new direction.
I think also statements that people like candidates in Colorado and New York have made about Israel would, even 2 years ago, have disqualified them from office forever. There's no way Democrats would have wanted them in that tent. Someone like Mamdani, and then by extension AOC, by extension Bernie Sanders, saying we're going to stand with them because they're with us on these other issues. And actually, is it so extreme to talk about sanctions on Israel, right? This is now part of the conversation we're in, where the Israeli extreme right has, of course, asked us to consider blessing some of their most just extreme, violent ideas, like ethnic cleansing of Gaza. And the left is saying, okay, well then let's look on the other side and sort of how far are you willing to go that way to right-size this relationship and the dynamic.
There has to be another option. There has to be a bit of equilibrium in that sense.
And I think voters will be the ones, right, who want to see a shift in policy. And now it's also on Democrats to show, if you entrust us with power, we'll do it at the federal level.
Yeah. And be explicit about that. I think just seeing Daria Liza's keffiyeh as part of her main campaign paraphernalia, literature, like in all of that, was really stand out to me. And he's making rounds in the Texas scene, but where do you think James Tallarico exists in kind of this spectrum of the new face of the Democratic Party?
I think the place where he exists is certainly closer to that outspoken on Gaza, willing to apply not a special standard to Israel, but the same American standard and the international law standard you would apply to anyone else, to that sort of question and that area. That I also think he's facing huge headwinds, not only in obviously trying to win in Texas, a deeply Republican state. He's facing huge headwinds from Jasmine Crockett, who is unhappy that she wasn't the candidate, and who continues to sort of encourage the idea that he has an issue with black voters, the base of the Democratic Party. And this is part of the question too, right? Is you've seen this come up in some of the Michigan races, where people have said, well, some of these progressive candidates are not in touch with the black base of the party, and I think that fissure needs to be healed. Some of that healing work has happened in New York, where the sense of these are not the candidates of gentrifiers. These are candidates deeply rooted in their communities who are in touch. But that's where I think Tallarico is facing maybe the most visible example of that, and his ability to bridge that will also be an important test for this more progressive wing as they come up.
Definitely. And I guess a final reflection on, I think what we're looking towards now is August 4th is what's going to happen in Michigan. So do you have kind of an analysis of where you think these next couple weeks are going to go, and what's on the horizon?
Yeah, what I'm closely tracking for the Michigan outcome is the growing awareness that Stevens is hugely backed by out-of-state money and by corporate money. So if for Democrats in Michigan who are really afraid, not only that they might lose to a Republican signed candidate this year, but that in 2028 the Trump administration will use their state to deny a Democrat the presidency. I'm curious if Michigan Democrats can address the question of, is Stevens really the most effective candidate against him? If some of these backers who are willing to support her right now against Abdul, will they be with her all the way through November? And talking to voters in Michigan, that's sort of the most important thing in that Democratic primary. Yes, there's a lot of bad blood between Haley and Abdul supporters over various issues. Israel, one of them, but also stylistic issues. The questions around, some of Haley Stevens' supporters feel he doesn't respect her record as a congresswoman or on the auto rescue. Can they unite to that question of what is a winning candidate for Democrats, or will the party remain so riven? And that's where I think the Warren move was very interesting in trying to pull together that McMurrow median voter.
Amazing.